The convoy never heard it coming. One moment, the American supply trucks were rolling along the jungle road in the pre-dawn darkness. The next, the tree line erupted in fire, not the scattered rifle cracks of an infantry ambush, not the delayed thump of mortars. This was something else, a metallic howl, a continuous tearing sound, and then the lead truck exploded into fragments. The sound was wrong, too fast, too furious, like nothing they'd trained for. It was May 1944, and the war in the Pacific had reached a brutal impasse. The Imperial Japanese Army, pushed back island by island, road by road, had begun improvising with a desperation that bordered on genius. Across the Philippines, Burma, and the shrinking perimeter of their empire, Japanese engineers faced a catastrophic problem. Their aircraft were being shot down faster than factories could replace them. Hundreds of fighter planes lay scattered across jungle airstrips, torn apart by American strafing runs, their fuselages riddled with holes, their engines seized. But their guns remained intact. The Type 99 20mm autocannon had been Japan's primary aircraft armament since 1939. Mounted in the wings of Zero fighters and mounted in bomber turrets, it fired explosive rounds at 300 rounds per minute. It could punch through aluminum fuselages at 1,000 yards. It had been designed to kill aircraft. But now, with air superiority lost and Allied infantry columns moving with near impunity through captured territory, Japanese field commanders began to see a different application. It started with the Type 98 20mm anti-aircraft gun, a purpose-built ground weapon that had been mounted on the back of Type 94 six-wheel trucks since the late 1930s. These mobile AA platforms had proven effective enough in defensive positions, deployed with tank divisions and airfield security units. But they were too few. Production had been limited. The invasion of the Philippines and the Allied push through Burma demanded more firepower, more mobility, more lethality than collapsing supply lines could provide. So they stripped the cannons from dead aircraft. At forward maintenance depots and field workshops, Japanese armors began pulling the Type 99 guns from wrecked fighters. They removed the belt feed mechanisms, salvaged the mounting brackets, and fabricated improvised carriages that could be bolted to beds of supply trucks. These weren't factory conversions. There were no blueprints, no standardized parts. Each truck was different. Some mounted a single cannon on a fixed tripod. Others carried twin-gun configurations, welded at opposing angles for wider field of fire. The crews worked fast, under pressure, with whatever materials they could scavenge. The result was a hybrid weapon system that shouldn't have worked as well as it did. The trucks themselves were civilian models, requisitioned from local populations or captured from retreating colonial forces. Most were Isuzu or Nissan flatbeds, underpowered and mechanically unreliable, already worn down by years of jungle roads and minimal maintenance. But they were mobile. They could be concealed under camouflage nets, positioned along tree lines, and relocated before counter-battery fire could zero in. And when they opened fire, the effect was catastrophic. The first recorded use came during the fighting around Manila in early 1945. As American forces pushed into the city, Japanese defensive positions relied heavily on improvised weapons. Anti-aircraft guns were lowered to ground level and used for direct fire against infantry. Naval guns were hauled inland and positioned in rubble-filled streets. And the truck-mounted aircraft cannons, which soldiers began calling roaring beasts for the distinctive sound they made when firing, began appearing along supply routes. The 20mm autocannon round was never designed for use against human targets. It was an anti-material weapon meant to disable engines and shred control surfaces. Against soft targets, the effect was almost obscene. A single round could pass through multiple bodies. High-explosive incendiary rounds, intended to ignite aircraft fuel tanks, detonated on impact with devastating fragmentation. Infantrymen caught in the open had no defense. Standard cover, trees, sandbags, even light vehicles offered no protection. The rounds punched through and kept going. But the real terror came from the ambush tactics. American and Allied forces had learned to respect Japanese infantry ambushes. The night attacks, the infiltration tactics, the willingness to die in place rather than retreat. They had adapted. They moved in larger formations. They called in air support at the first sign of resistance. They learned not to bunch up, not to stop in predictable locations, not to assume the jungle was ever truly clear. But the roaring beast changed the equation. A truck-mounted cannon could be positioned on a ridgeline overlooking a valley road. It could sit silent for hours, even days, waiting for the right target. The crew, usually 4 men, would live in the jungle nearby, rationing water and rice, enduring the mosquitoes and the heat. They would watch American patrols pass below, resisting the urge to fire. They were waiting for something bigger. A convoy, a supply column, a company on the move. When the target appeared, the ambush unfolded in seconds. The gunner, seated behind the cannon, would track the lead vehicle through iron sights. At a range of 200 yards, sometimes less, he would open fire. The first burst was always into the lead truck, not to destroy it, but to stop it, to create a roadblock. The following vehicles, unable to maneuver on the narrow jungle roads, would accordion into each other, stalling the entire column. Then the gunner would traverse left and right, walking fire down the line. 30, 40, 50 rounds in a continuous burst. Trucks exploded. Fuel tanks ignited. Men dove for the ditches, scrambling for cover that didn't exist. The 20mm rounds followed them, churning earth, splintering trees, tearing through anything in their path. The ambush rarely lasted more than a minute. Once the belt was empty, the crew would abandon the position. They knew the response would be immediate and overwhelming. American doctrine called for immediate suppressive fire, followed by flanking maneuvers and artillery. But by the time the counterstrike arrived, the truck would be gone, driven deeper into jungle or concealed under heavy vegetation. The Japanese had learned to position their escape routes in advance. They never used the same site twice. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical casualties. American infantry had come to trust their material superiority. They had more trucks, more ammunition, more air support, more of everything. The Japanese were supposed to be on the defensive, dug into bunkers, waiting to be dislodged. But the roaring beasts represented something else. They were proof that the enemy could still strike first, still dictate the terms of engagement, still exact a horrific price even in retreat. Survivors described the sound as unforgettable, not the sharp crack of rifle fire, which the ear could process and localize. This was a continuous mechanical roar, a sustained ripping noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. By the time you registered the sound, the rounds were already impacting. There was no time to take cover, no time to return fire. You simply dropped and prayed. After-action reports began documenting a pattern. Convoys ambushed by roaring beasts suffered casualty rates far higher than standard infantry engagements. In one incident near Baguio in the northern Philippines, a single truck-mounted cannon destroyed 11 vehicles and killed 47 men in less than 2 minutes. Another attack along the Burma road left an entire company pinned down for 6 hours, unable to advance or retreat until air support could identify and neutralize the position. But finding the guns was nearly impossible. The trucks had no distinctive heat signature. They used no radios that could be triangulated. They fired from concealed positions, often from reverse slopes or dense jungle where aerial observation was useless. American forces tried sending out hunter-killer teams, small units tasked with locating and destroying the mobile cannons. Most came back empty-handed. A few didn't come back at all. The Japanese crews, for their part, understood they were operating on borrowed time. The trucks were mechanically fragile. Spare parts were non-existent. Ammunition was scavenged from downed aircraft and captured stockpiles, and once it ran out, the weapon was useless. Crew life expectancy was measured in weeks. If the Americans didn't kill them, disease would. Malaria, dysentery, and tropical infections ravaged Japanese units cut off from medical supply. Many gun crews simply disappeared, abandoning their trucks and fading into the jungle when they could no longer fight. Yet they kept fighting. One crew, operating in the hills above IPO Dam northeast of Manila, held their position for 16 days. They had a single truck, a twin-gun configuration, and approximately 800 rounds. They used it to interdict a critical supply road. Firing in short, disciplined bursts to conserve ammunition. They destroyed or damaged more than 30 vehicles before American forces brought in a full infantry battalion and artillery support to clear the area. When the position was finally overrun, the truck was found abandoned, its guns spiked with grenades to render them useless. The crew was never located. The improvised nature of the weapon system also meant that no two trucks were exactly alike. Some carried cannons mounted on simple pintle mounts, allowing 360 degrees of traverse, but offering no armor protection for the crew. Others featured crude gun shields, welded from scavenged metal plates, which provided minimal cover from small arms fire. A few rare examples incorporated dual gun setups, with cannons positioned to fire in opposite directions, allowing the truck to engage targets on either side of the road without repositioning. But every configuration shared the same fundamental weakness. The trucks were soft-skinned and vulnerable. A single rifle round through the radiator could disable the vehicle. A well-placed grenade could destroy the gun mount. And once immobilized, the crew had no escape. The Americans learned quickly that the best counter tactic was not to engage directly, but to call in artillery or air strikes the moment contact was made. Even if the initial barrage missed, it forced the gun crew to displace, often abandoning their weapon in the process. Still, the roaring beast achieved something that more conventional weapons could not. They disrupted the Allied timetable. They forced convoys to move with heavier escorts, which slowed the pace of advance. They created a climate of fear and uncertainty that extended far beyond the physical casualties they inflicted. Every jungle road became suspect. Every curve in the trail was a potential kill zone. The war, which had seemed to be entering its final phase, took on a grinding, attritional character that sapped morale and stretched supply lines. By mid-1945, the number of operational truck-mounted cannons had dwindled to a handful. Most had been destroyed in place or abandoned when their ammunition ran out. The Japanese defenders, reduced to small isolated units, no longer had the logistical capability to sustain mobile operations. The roaring beasts, which had once terrorized Allied columns, were slowly hunted down and eliminated, but their impact lingered. American military analysts, conducting post-war assessments, noted the effectiveness of the improvised weapon system. The concept of mounting aircraft armament on mobile ground platforms was not new. The Germans and Soviets had experimented with similar designs, but the Japanese implementation, born of desperation and executed with limited resources, had proven remarkably lethal. It was a case study in asymmetric warfare, a demonstration of how a technologically inferior force could leverage innovation and tactical flexibility to offset material disadvantages. The soldiers who survived encounters with the roaring beasts carried a memory for the rest of their lives. They spoke of the sound, always the sound, that terror mechanical howl, that signaled death was already in the air. They remembered the helplessness, the inability to fight back against an enemy that struck with overwhelming firepower and vanished before retaliation could arrive. And they remembered the trucks themselves, battered civilian vehicles transformed into instruments of precision violence, driven by men who knew they were already dead but chose to keep fighting anyway. In the broader narrative of the Pacific War, the truck-mounted aircraft cannons occupy a small, almost forgotten chapter. They were never mass-produced. They never altered the strategic outcome of the conflict. But for the men who faced them on the jungle roads of the Philippines and Burma, they represented something fundamental about the nature of war itself. Desperation breeds innovation. Scarcity forces adaptation. And sometimes, the most dangerous weapons are not the ones designed by engineers in distant factories, but the ones improvised in the field by soldiers who have nothing left to lose. The Japanese called them roaring beasts, and the name was apartment. They were predators born of necessity, stitched together from the wreckage of a dying air force, crewed by men who had already accepted their fate. They hunted supply convoys with cold efficiency, struck without warning, and disappeared into the jungle before the enemy could respond. They were a reminder that even in the final days of a losing war, even when the outcome was no longer in doubt, the capacity for human ingenuity and lethality remained undiminished. The last confirmed sighting of a roaring beast came in July 1945, less than a month before the Japanese surrender. An American reconnaissance patrol in northern Luzon encountered a lone truck, its flatbed mounted with what appeared to be a twin cannon configuration, positioned on a hillside overlooking a destroyed bridge. The truck had been abandoned. The guns were still in place, their barrels aimed down the valley. There was no ammunition, no crew, just the empty vehicle, rusting in the tropical heat, waiting for an enemy that would never come. The patrol radioed in the location, and an airstrike was called in to destroy the position. It was standard procedure. Leave nothing for the enemy to reclaim. The bombs fell. The truck disappeared in a cloud of flame and smoke, and the war moved on. But the idea, the brutal elegance of the improvised weapon, did not disappear. In the decade that followed, in conflicts across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, the concept of the civilian vehicle armed with heavy weaponry, would become a staple of asymmetric warfare. From the Toyota pickups mounting machine guns in the deserts of Chad to the armored trucks carrying anti-aircraft guns through the streets of Mogadishu, the lineage could be traced back to those Japanese crews in the jungles of 1945, who took what they had and turned it into something terrifying. The lesson, if there was one, was simple. Innovation does not require resources. It requires necessity. And in war, necessity is the only force more powerful than firepower. The roaring beasts were born in defeat, wielded by an army that had already lost, against an enemy that held every material advantage. They should not have been as effective as they were. But war is not a ledger of resources and production numbers. It is a contest of will, adaptation, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to survive one more day. The Japanese gun crews understood this. They understood that even a single truck, armed with a salvage cannon, could become a weapon that shaped the battlefield, disrupted the enemy's plans, and bought time for comrades elsewhere. They understood that sometimes the roar of a beast is enough to make the hunter hesitate. And in that hesitation, in that moment of fear and uncertainty, they found their purpose. Not to win the war, that was already lost, but to prove that even in the final days, even in the face of inevitable defeat, the human capacity for defiance and ingenuity could not be extinguished. The roaring beasts are gone now. The trucks have rusted away. The crews who manned them have long since passed into history. But the roads they defended, the convoys they destroyed, and the soldiers who survived their ambushes carry forward a truth that transcends the specifics of that war. That desperation, when channeled with intelligence and resolve, can be as deadly as any factory-made weapon. That the tools of war are only as effective as the minds that wield them, and that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most resources, but the one with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. If this story made you rethink what improvisation and desperation could achieve in war, subscribe now for more forgotten battles and untold tactics from history's darkest moments. The mechanics of mounting an aircraft cannon to a truck bed were deceptively simple in concept, but brutally difficult in execution. The Type 99 autocannon, stripped from its wing housing, weighed approximately 40 kilograms without ammunition. The mounting bracket, designed to absorb the recoil forces within a reinforced airframe, had to be adapted to the far weaker structure of a civilian truck chassis. Japanese field engineers addressed this by welding steel crossbeams beneath the truck bed, creating a reinforced platform that distributed recoil across the frame rather than concentrating it at a single point. But the real challenge was elevation and traverse. Aircraft guns were designed to fire along a fixed axis, with the aircraft itself maneuvering to bring the weapon on target. On a truck, the gun needed independent movement. Early improvisations used salvaged ball-mount turrets from bomber defensive positions, but these were rare and difficult to install. Most crews settled for simpler solutions. A pintle mount bolted to the truck bed, with a crude shoulder rest and hand grips salvaged from machine gun assemblies. Elevation was controlled manually, with the gunner physically lifting or depressing the barrel. It was exhausting work, and accuracy suffered, but at the ranges these weapons typically engaged, precision was less important than volume of fire. Ammunition presented another problem. The Type 99 used a 60-round drum magazine in its original aircraft configuration, but these were incompatible with ground use. The drums required manual changing, which meant a rate of fire limited to short bursts with long pauses between. Japanese armorers solved this by converting the feed system to use belt ammunition, scavenged from machine gun stockpiles, or fabricated by hand from individual rounds. The belts were unreliable. They jammed frequently, but when they worked, they allowed sustained fire that could empty 200 rounds in under a minute. The crews who manned these trucks were not elite units. They were not the highly trained pilots who had once flown the aircraft from which the cannons came. They were supply soldiers, rear echelon troops, men deemed unfit for frontline infantry duty due to age or injury. Some were veterans of earlier campaigns, pulled from garrison duty and hastily retrained. Others were conscripts from occupied territories, pressed into service with minimal preparation. What they lacked in training, they compensated for with desperation. One such crew operated out of a hidden position near the town of Bambang in the Cagayan Valley. Their truck was a Nissan 180, a civilian flatbed that had been commandeered from a local logging company. The cannon was a single Type 99, mounted on a reinforced tripod with limited traverse. The crew consisted of 4 men, a driver, a gunner, and 2 loaders. The gunner, a former mechanic named Tanaka, had never fired a weapon larger than a rifle before being assigned to crew. He learned by necessity, with no manuals, no formal instruction, just the practical guidance of the crew chief and the unforgiving feedback of live combat. Their first engagement came on a morning in late April. An American supply convoy, 12 trucks carrying ammunition and rations, was moving north along Route 5. Intelligence, passed down from retreating Japanese units, had identified the convoy's departure time and likely route. Tanaka's crew had positioned their truck on a low ridge overlooking a straight section of road, concealed beneath a camouflage net woven from palm fronds and jungle vines. They had been in position for 18 hours, lying still in the pre-dawn cold, listening to the distant rumble of American artillery. When the convoy appeared, Tanaka felt his hands begin to shake. He had trained on the gun for less than a week. He had never seen combat. The lead American truck was less than 150 yards away, close enough that he could see the silhouettes of drivers through the windshields. The crew chief tapped his shoulder, the signal to fire, and Tanaka squeezed the trigger. The gun roared. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, harder than he expected, and the truck beneath him shuddered. The first burst went high, rounds snapping over the convoy and into the jungle beyond. He corrected, lowering the barrel, and fired again. This time the rounds found their mark. The lead truck's engine block exploded, steam and smoke erupting from the hood. The vehicle slewed sideways and stopped, blocking the road. The rest of the convoy stalled behind it. Tanaka traversed left, tracking the second truck, and fired a longer burst. High explosive rounds punched through the canvas covering, detonating inside the cargo bed. Men spilled out, running for the ditches. He fired again. And again, the gun bucked and roared, the sound overwhelming, the spent casings clattering onto the truck bed like metallic rain. He lost count of how many rounds he fired. The loaders worked frantically, feeding the belt into the weapon, shouting warnings when the barrel began to overheat. Below, the convoy was in chaos. Trucks burned. Men screamed. Return fire snapped through trees, but the Americans couldn't pinpoint the source. Tanaka kept firing until the belt ran dry, until the barrel glowed dull red, until the crew chief grabbed his shoulder and shouted that it was time to go. They abandoned position in less than 30 seconds. The driver gunned the engine, and the truck lurched down a concealed trail, crashing through underbrush, putting distance between them and the ambush site. Behind them, they heard the crump of American mortars beginning to bracket the ridge. They were already gone. Tanaka's hands didn't stop shaking for an hour. That ambush, like hundreds of others, was never formally recorded. It appeared in American after-action reports as an enemy contact. Casualties sustained, position neutralized by indirect fire. But for Tanaka and his crew, it was the beginning of a routine that would define the next 3 months of their lives. They would move every 2 days, never staying in the same position, never using the same route twice. They would scavenge ammunition from destroyed aircraft and captured stockpiles, hoarding every round. They would eat whatever they could forage or steal, often going days without resupply. And they would wait endlessly for the next convoy. The psychological toll was immense. Tanaka had been raised to believe in duty, in loyalty to the emperor, in the righteousness of Japan's cause. But alone in the jungle, watching through the sights as men, enemy soldiers but men nonetheless, died under his gun, those beliefs began to crack. He did not speak of it. None of them did. To voice doubt was to invite accusations of cowardice. And in the brutal hierarchy of a desperate army, cowardice was met with execution. So they buried their thoughts and focused on survival. The Americans, for their part, struggled to counter the roaring beasts. Standard infantry tactics were useless. By the time a convoy could deploy defensive fire, the truck was already displacing. Artillery was effective only if the spotter could identify the exact firing position, and in the dense jungle, that was nearly impossible. Air support was the most reliable solution, but it required time to coordinate, and the Japanese crews never stayed in place long enough for aircraft to arrive. One American innovation proved partially effective: the use of decoy convoys. Empty trucks, sometimes rigged with explosives, would be sent along known ambush routes to bait the Japanese into revealing their positions. If a roaring beast opened fire, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Fighter bombers, orbiting at altitude, would dive on the firing position, saturating the area with bombs and rockets. It worked sometimes, but it was resource-intensive, and it required the Japanese to take the bait, which they often did not. The decoy tactic claimed Tanaka's crew in early July. They had been tracking a convoy for 2 days, waiting for the right moment to strike. The convoy seemed smaller than usual, only 6 trucks, and it moved slowly, as if overloaded. Tanaka's crew chief suspected a trap, but they were low on ammunition and desperate for resupply. They decided to take the risk. Tanaka opened fire at a range of 200 yards. The lead truck exploded, exactly as planned, but there was no follow-up chaos. The remaining trucks didn't stop. They accelerated, scattering off the road and into prepared positions. And then the sky tore open. American thunderbolts, pre-positioned and waiting for the ambush, dove from cloud cover, their .50 caliber machine guns raking the ridgeline. The truck disintegrated. The driver was killed instantly. One of the loaders was thrown clear by the blast and died in the underbrush. Tanaka and the crew chief survived only because they had been positioned on the opposite side of the truck, shielded by the chassis. They ran, abandoning the gun, abandoning everything, and disappeared into the jungle. Tanaka never saw another roaring beast. He spent the remaining weeks of the war hiding in the mountains, living on roots and insects, until the surrender order came down in August. He returned to his village to find it destroyed, his family scattered, his world unrecognizable. He never spoke of the war. He never mentioned the truck, the gun, or the men he had killed. He lived another 50 years, working in obscurity, carrying the weight of those months in silence. His story was not unique. Across the Philippines and Burma, hundreds of similar crews fought similar battles, achieved similar results, and met similar ends. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were not commemorated with monuments or medals. They were desperate men, wielding improvised weapons, fighting a war they knew was lost. But in the annals of military history, their impact cannot be dismissed. The roaring beasts, crude and unreliable as they were, forced the Allied forces to adapt, to slow down, to rethink their approach to supply line security. They demonstrated that even a collapsing army, stripped of air power and naval support, could still inflict meaningful damage through ingenuity and determination. They proved that the most dangerous weapon is not always the most advanced, but the one wielded with nothing left to lose. The final accounting of the roaring beasts will never be complete. No comprehensive records exist detailing how many trucks were converted, how many crews operated them, or how many casualties they inflicted. The Japanese military, in its final chaotic months, had ceased maintaining detailed logs. The Americans, focused on victory, did not prioritize documenting every improvised weapon they encountered. But the legacy remains. In the evolution of modern warfare, in the prevalence of improvised fighting vehicles, in the understanding that mobility and firepower can be combined with minimal resources, the roaring beasts left their mark. They were not the first truck-mounted guns in history, but they were among the most effective in demonstrating how desperation could be weaponized, how the tools of defeat could become instruments of defiance. And for the soldiers who faced them, who heard the roar and felt the fear, the lesson was unforgettable. That war is not won solely by those with the most resources, but by those who refuse to quit even when victory is impossible. That courage and ingenuity are not the exclusive domain of the victors, and that sometimes the enemy you underestimate is the one that costs you the most. If you want to hear more stories of desperate innovation and forgotten tactics that change the face of war, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from.